Kelly Dagan is Research, Instruction, and User Experience Librarian at Amherst College. Kelly will be discussing the role of voice interaction and discovery and some of those implications for library and the academy. So Kelly, I can see your slides. You're all set to go.
All right, great. Thanks so much for that introduction. So welcome, everyone. In this section, we'll be diving into the user experience of voice interfaces specifically and thinking about some implications for academia. So as research, instruction, and user experience librarian at Amherst, I get to wear multiple hats across teaching research, supporting faculty and students, and leading library UX and assessment projects. If any folks out there aren't familiar with UX or user experience, the shortest possible definition might be it's a field that investigates how to make things that are useful, usable, valuable, and accessible for the people you're designing for. So a brief overview. Today, we'll be talking about types of voice interfaces, some broad themes affecting voice search and academic discovery, user hopes and potentially expectations for such systems, and some associated requirements for a good user experience. But first, there are a lot of terms flying around when it comes to voice-related technology, so let's just get some definitions started. Voice devices come in many flavors. Basically, voice user interfaces are designs in which voice is a primary mode of input or output. They can be voice only, or they can be multimodal with other interfaces like a screen. Voice assistants are a form of intelligent personal assistant or a digital assistant that uses voice as an interface. So all those names that we keep hearing about. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing on voice assistants and voice search, so nothing about smart fridges. And you may have noticed a lot of voice-related developments happening recently, and that brings me to my first driving theme, with apologies to Mark Andreessen. By all accounts, popularity and use of voice interfaces is growing rapidly and seems to be approaching a saturation point. You may have read the news stories about hotel chains putting smart speakers in every room, or the new kids edition of the Echo Dot. So voice technologies are cropping up everywhere, but it can be tough to get a handle on exactly how common or accepted voice technology is. But there are a few things that we can look at as indicators. A 2017 Pew survey found that 46% of Americans use digital voice assistants. There's evidence that younger generations acclimated to voice very quickly. Even back in 2014, a Google study reported 55% of teenagers using voice search more than once a day, and 31%, just under a third, reported using it for help with homework. Today, there's some evidence that voice interfaces might be becoming sort of a background technology for earlier education and childhood, with a quarter of households with voice assistants and children engaging with them for help with homework. Now, if you do even a basic open web search on voice technology, you'll find all sorts of grand predictions and statistics. Favorite quote is, by 2020, 50% of searches will be voice searches. It is 2019 right now, so it's a little difficult to separate the actual state of affairs from a lot of the enthusiasm going on right now. As a side note, as far as I can tell, that 50% by 2050 quote was actually sort of a misquote from the chief scientist of the Chinese search engine Baidu. And it was specifically about the Chinese search market, and it referred to both voice and image searching. So reference librarian fun there. But still, we can see voice assistants and voice search making their way into people's lives in two main ways, through smart speakers and smartphones. Nielsen's latest report in 2018 estimated that nearly a quarter of US households now own at least one smart speaker, and many of them have several. Back in 2016, Google reported that 20% of all searches through their smartphone app were done via voice. And this is a global trend. A 2018 report by Global Web Index found that 27% of the global online population is using mobile voice search, with the highest use in the Asia Pacific region. And as of a ComScore survey of smartphone users in 2017, 1 in 2 users reported using voice technology on their devices, so things like voice commands and voice search. So, with voice interactions becoming common practice for many of us, this is likely shaping user expectations. But what's so great about voice? Well, for one, it's an incredibly efficient mode for inputting information. As Perna Virji explains, you can type 38 to 40 words per minute on a mobile device, but you can speak at least 150 words per minute. So voice can be a form of natural user interface, which means that if the interaction is designed well, it feels intuitive and doesn't require much cognitive effort. Compare speaking with, say, typing on a tiny screen with your thumbs. Second, voice is pretty well matched for situations where we're multitasking. A 2018 Google survey found that being able to, quote, more easily multitask was the #1 reason people cited for using their smart speakers. So it's great for situations where our hands and eyes are busy, or maybe when we're on the go. Third, voice interactions also appeal to our desires for instant gratification and speed. The #2 and #3 reasons cited for using smart speakers were to, quote, do things faster and, quote, instantly get answers and information. Smart speakers and voice assistants represent an always-on, ubiquitous presence that is ready to provide help. Finally, interactions with voice feel more like social interactions, even when they're not with a human. Speech is so fundamental to our biology that we often don't have conscious control over our reactions. Even when we know we're talking to a machine, our brain often doesn't distinguish a difference, and people tend to apply the same social rules. This led researchers Clifford Nass and Scott Brave in the book Wired for Speech to conclude that, quote, voice interfaces are intrinsically social interfaces. Reflecting this, 41% of users in that Google survey said that using their smart speaker, quote, feels like talking to a friend or another person. So all of these factors might help explain the appeal of voice technologies. And I'd add one more that's maybe difficult to quantify. It feels like magic when it works. Like you just say something and the world changes in some way. It's pretty close to wizardry. And we all want to be wizards. We need to be wizards because we have a lot to manage these days. This brings me to my second theme, which is our mobile on-demand approach to information. This is linked to the rise of smartphones in academia, which are considered academic success tools in their own right. The 2018 ECAR study of undergraduate students in information technology found that over half of students rated their smartphone as very or extremely important for their academic success, and over 80% of them used it for at least one class. Also, smartphones were seen as significantly more important by students who are non-white, first generation, from families with lower incomes, and students with disabilities. At the University of Central Florida back in 2016, 69% of students reported using mobile apps for learning at least once a week, with regular use of Google Search and Dictionary. So students are engaging with learning resources in a mobile context and using mobile devices. In this time-scarce world, we're all seeking greater efficiency, and voice search is pretty well established now for answering simple reference questions in practice. In multiple voice assistant user surveys, people say that they often use voice assistants for answering a general question or seeking information or searching for a quick fact. That was the top use of digital assistants in 2019, according to Microsoft. Google is, of course, well aware of this trend, and they've been taking steps to optimize their search results for voice interactions. The ultimate goal is to provide one single accurate answer to factual queries. Because of course in voice search, having a single answer is a requirement. No one's going to listen to 30,000 pages of search results. When you remember that convenience is a critical factor for undergraduate information needs, the efficiencies of voice search become even more important. Convenience and efficiency needs aren't unique to students, however. research on faculty practices have found that faculty also struggle to manage time demands and employ similar skimming and scanning practices as undergraduates when searching for information. Finally, in an always-going multitasking world, our perceptions towards the getting of information often shift. Searching for material becomes functional, not reflective, and efficiency and productivity become key. Users grab things intending to read or evaluate them fully later. The act of getting isn't necessarily connected to the act of thinking through the topic or question. In a 2010 study of millennial students' mental models of search, only about a third of participants actually read articles or sites in depth when deciding whether to use them. Usually, the decision was made in a matter of seconds. This third trend is pretty broad across academia, and it has to do with personalizing the educational experience. Campuses are looking for ways to stand out, and personalization is one of them. Voice assistants are being used as one avenue for this work. Three high-profile examples are Arizona State University, Northeastern University, and St. Louis University. All three campuses ran programs with Amazon-based voice assistant devices. St. Louis went the furthest so far, putting Echo Dots in every student residence room on campus. They developed skills or programmed voice interactions designed to provide answers to common questions related to campus events, student life, academic support, facilities, and more. Campuses with these programs have cited benefits including reducing cognitive load, reducing student anxiety, meeting students' expectations for seamless, efficient experiences, and helping students feel more connected to the university, thinking about, again, voice as a social experience. As I said earlier, common practices often shape user expectations. So with that in mind, let's look at some potential user hopes and maybe expectations for voice-related technologies in academia. So users are already pretty primed to expect voice interactions for straightforward questions and simple interactions. Even navigating a website to locate answers is fairly inefficient compared to voice. Instead of a website FAQ, voice interactions could provide quick answers to common questions. For example, those campus voice assistants were often programmed with answers to variations on the question of when is the library open? With voice commands and voice assistants, people are becoming more accustomed to telling their digital assistants to do things like book places, make appointments, and set reminders. Integration with library systems would make these interactions more voice-friendly and would meet their expectations here. Just a note that it seems like vendors are jumping on board for these needs fairly quickly. Overdrive is developing voice command support for their Libby app, including finding and playing audiobooks. EBSCO is using its API to allow users to access content via Alexa and Google Home. And Demco has developed an Alexa skill for Discover Local, allowing patrons to check branch hours and services, reserve rooms, place holds, and renew items. On another level, there's also a user appetite for making the search process itself more efficient and conversational. So thinking about our on-the-go context, having the ability to ask an interface to gather, let's say, overviews on a topic or key sources in a field to review later can make a lot of sense. At the 2018 Electronic Resources and Libraries Conference, EBSCO Director of Field Engineering Eric Frierson recently demoed exactly these abilities, using an Amazon Echo to bring up overviews, information on specific topics, and related works. Now, this set of use cases in particular requires considerable work, but these are all potentially appealing to our time-sensitive users. As we've already explored, voice assistant users are getting pretty acclimated to factual results through voice search. Asking a digital assistant to find overviews in order to get started on a topic could represent a next step in that process. In a faculty context, voice may offer greater efficiencies in keeping up to date on their fields. Some enterprising scholars are already creating Alexa skills to find and read the most recent abstracts in their fields, providing an on-the-go briefing that allows them to quickly judge whether an article is worth reading more in depth. A recent focus group at the Pratt Institute specifically investigated user requirements for intelligent personal assistants in an academic context. Participants described an interactive tool that helped them customize their searches and find more specific results. That's the quote for "like having a research assistant in my phone." This would require some conversational capability in voice assistants to support a sustained back and forth with refinement. And at the moment, searching would probably perform best in well-structured, bounded conditions with very specific criteria. But in terms of ultimate dreams, a focus group study back in 2001 at the University of Idaho hinted at what undergraduate students might dream of in a voice interface for academia. When asked to describe a dream information machine, all of the students described a device using voice recognition and natural language to perform comprehensive searches for them. It would also be portable, of course, and accessible 24/7. Obviously, we don't have the capabilities for this dream machine, but it certainly exists as a user desire. All voice-based interactions, however, come with certain user requirements for the experience. Without addressing these, we'll end up with a lot of problems and a detrimental experience overall. And many of these actually echo what Jim described in his study just now. The first one, privacy. Privacy is a big concern, and it's become relatively widespread among users with recent news. This has not only to do with how recordings are made and managed, but also security risks in these voice systems. It's already been proven that these devices can be hacked and turned into wiretaps. Poor differentiation between user voices makes it possible for fraudulent charges or access of sensitive personal data. Users are becoming more aware of and less comfortable with how major platforms are tracking their behavior and using their data. If we don't honor and address these concerns, we're not building a good UX. Accessibility is another key requirement. While voice interfaces may be more accessible for certain populations, including those with visual and motor disabilities, they can be inaccessible for those with auditory, speech, or cognitive issues. Transparency and customization are also important. Users can feel disempowered or lack trust when it isn't clear to them how these devices work. They can be frustrated by limited or no ability to customize the operations of these devices. In fact, trust in this situation can cut both ways. You need users' trust in the results and operation, but there's also the potential for users to be too trusting of results. For example, current product marketing practices in voice assistants often involve forms of sponsored information. So recipes, stain removal techniques, allergy management tips. Researchers are starting to indicate that when the information source isn't referenced by these devices, users don't question the quality or the intent of the information provided. There's a lot of interest, in fact, in how voice assistants and other AI-enabled devices affect our perceptions of and trust in technology. One study by the MIT Media Lab in 2017 showed that trust starts early. Among children aged 3 to 10 years old interacting with Alexa and Google Home, they found that most of the children had complete trust in the devices and believed that they were being truthful. This has major implications for how voice-based systems would contextualize and present information. If you thought relevancy ranking was important now, it's even more so here. Meeting user expectations is another requirement. Voice-based interactions tend to build expectations for a true back and forth conversation, and people generally have poor understandings of the real limitations of these devices, so you get to see a lot of hashtags with device fail. A mismatch between expectations and capabilities will lead to user frustration, disappointment, and disuse. This has been sort of a brief and whirlwind tour of some of the factors and possibilities surrounding voice-based interaction in an academic context. Voice certainly isn't the best mode for every need or context. For example, public spaces can be really poorly suited for voice commands, and research has shown that people generally aren't comfortable engaging with voice interfaces in public areas. And even if they were, it would make things get pretty noisy really quick. Speaking of comfort, some users just aren't comfortable talking to a computer, period, even in private. And finally, personal and sensitive content can be really fraught when it comes to voice for pretty obvious reasons. Besides matching the right need and context, there are major requirements that we need to address for a good user experience if we're thinking about voice technologies. There's a lot of thought and design that would need to go into how the interaction works and ensuring that we're honoring user desires for privacy, accessibility, and control, as well as managing trust and expectations. But it's an exciting time to think about the possibilities. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm open to questions.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. A couple of questions come to mind on your talk. Thank you. You mentioned a couple vendors, as I think you mentioned Overdrive, EBSCO, maybe Demco also, who are developing or deploying some of these automated discovery system, automated systems. And they're using Alexa as back-end technology. I'm wondering if those vendors are clear that the services are piping data through Amazon. Do you know if that's the case?
I don't know how transparent they're being in communicating these services. I mean, that is a huge concern that people have brought up, that when you're using these platforms, they are essentially designed to track people. And so that's something that we would definitely need to talk about as librarians and as a profession. Unfortunately, I didn't get to attend any of the presentations, so I'm not sure how they're framing it, but it would be a really important point not to miss.
Yeah, because, I mean, a patron might be, for whatever reason, reticent to share their data with Amazon, but not think twice about it sending it through Overdrive or EBSCO because, oh, well, it's a library service, they're trusted in the library community, but not understanding that ultimately the data is getting passed on through Amazon. And that issue of transparency, which you raised, I think is a really critical one. And simply putting another company's brand on the back end of one company's services kind of interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of personal anxieties around this topic, but yeah, managing trust by being transparent and making sure that we are not handing over data in ways that users aren't aware of, that's a key point.
Yeah. Another point that you raised in your presentation has to do with the comfort level of some communities and some people of using these voice-driven assistants. I'm interested to get your perspective there on whether or not that has value for disadvantaged or maybe first-generation students who, maybe, if they're anything like my kids, particularly tied to their phones, used to talking to their phones, do you think maybe that might provide a way to reduce anxiety or engagement with the library and library services?
I think that's one of the avenues, like with the campus programs that many people are thinking about, is this idea of voice being able to provide a certain level of reassurance and provide a sense of connection and allow students to be able to ask questions and, express things that maybe they wouldn't be comfortable expressing to a member of the administration or even a super friendly librarian. I do think that we would absolutely need to do more research and investigation to make sure that we are honoring and balancing the requirements of trust and privacy there, especially with marginalized populations, because of just the history of surveillance and practices that have gone on in the past. So I think it could be a tool for enhancing connection, but again, it can cut both ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, well, fantastic. I want to, both Kelly and Jim raised the issue of privacy and of the privacy implications, and we're kind of touching on this a little bit in some of these talks. We're going to go full bore into some of those issues next week when we circle around and talk about personalization and the involvement of user data in these systems. So that's why we're kind of glancing by some of these topics and not digging terribly deep into them now. But we will be addressing them in a lot more detail next week. So Kelly, thank you so much for your talk.